We're outside the wall, and today we'll be talking about the umbrellas of Cherbourg with Wally
Hello.
and Evil Dex,
Hey,
and I'm Raim, and so we this is part of French Fortnite that we had. The last movie we had seen was the Brotherhood of the Wolf, and now we have watched the Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which is a musical directed by Jacques Demy. So Um, will be Evil X, if you'd like to start.
okay. So I've been watching actually a decent number of musicals this year, but this is the first one I've seen in French in my life, and it's also the first one I've seen that is a total musical, which is to say that all of the spoken lines are sung rather than the more standard format where characters speak as in a normal movie most of the time, but then will occasionally break into song numbers. And I didn't mind that, but I think I do prefer the other way, the normal way, as you might say. It's more satisfying when the song numbers I think are choreographed into um like just a small section that's more focused in that way. You sort of has a definite musical progression. But it was a kind of interesting change of pace to see a movie done this way. Narratively, what I liked was that took this sort of depressing turn around the second act, where at first it looks like kind of a standard romance story between a man and a woman, but then the man gets sent away, gets drafted and sent away to war, and when he returns, the woman has married somebody else, and his life's kind of just in the dumps. That was also definitely an interesting change of pace from the usual sort of thing, and made for a pretty satisfying story that had some realistic elements. It had a nice kind of bittersweet ending to it, which I appreciated. I guess that's a good enough summary. I'll pass it on to you now, Wally.
Yes, for me as well, this was both the first non-English musical I've seen, as well as the first musical that also was done entirely in sing-song. I've While I do have some experience with musicals, I've seen enough Rodgers and Hammerstein, Andrew Lloyd Webber, and some Gilbert and Sullivan plays. I'm by no means a connoisseur, so don't take that anything I say as some sort of expertise in the art form. Um, but this, yes, was a change of pace. It was definitely an ending that I was at least pleasantly surprised that didn't follow the typical romance of a happy ending. There was a sort of happy ending, but not in the way that I think most viewers will go in expecting to see. Um, it is odd for such a short film. Was it like an hour and a half that was broken up into three different parts? It's not something that I expect to see in so short of a film, but I guess, is the film's way of kind of breaking up the time periods because it takes place over, I think, is it what, 5 years, 6 years, the total film. Um, so yes, it was interesting. I didn't hate it, but I'm not going to go out and say that this is like an amazing film, but I appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah, so in my case, I think I've seen about the least of musicals. In I've seen also some animated musicals like Disney ones, like Lion King. Other ones that we watched together with The Wall in the past, Alan Parker's adaptation of Pink Floyd's album, and so some are there, but this was also the first one that I watched where every line was being sung, and it was an interesting experience, I would say. This movie basically deals with Guy, the main character, who falls in love with this girl called Genevieve that works in an umbrella shop, but then he gets drafted, and it deals with the aftermath of it. I would say that I also enjoyed how it's not a fully cheerful film, even though the film has a very agreeable color palette, and the settings are very vivid in general. But it is it has a more probably, let's say, realistic approach to some of the things that that end up happening, you could say, yeah, it's not always all yellow and roses in life. It's so bright, but there's still a way to basically end up with what you could say somehow satisfying ending to that progression in your life. This is also the first musical that I see in French, I believe. And I did enjoy it. I'm actually I actually recently found out that this is actually kind of part of like a trilogy of films that this guy did. There's actually a character that's very important to the film, Kassar, that's apparently part of the main cast of a previous film called Lola, and he does mention it in this film. So it does seem that it has a loose progression, but even if you hadn't seen the other film, you really didn't need to. This film stands on its own for what it is. So yeah, that's my perspective on it.
Okay. So one other film we could compare this to, of course, is La La Land, which unfortunately I'm the only one of the three of us who has seen.
Correct.
Yeah, you can see this was a little bit of a source of inspiration on that. Two things they share in common are, to a certain extent, the progression that the romance follows, which I won't say anything more about to try and avoid spoiling, and also that narrative structure of splitting it into distinct parts for each period of time. La La Land is set over the course of like a single year and has a title card signifying the change of seasons, which kind of comes from the three-part structure with title cards that this has, I guess. I would say I liked La La Land a little bit better out of the two of them, though, personally.
Well, I guess technically, now that I think of it, most plays have it split up in three parts because most plays are split up into 3 acts or at least 2 acts.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, more just part of the way the plays themselves are done. So, like, if it were an actual stage play, it gives a chance for the actors to, change attire, for the stagehands to change up the stage and stuff. So I think that's basically just taking it and almost transliterating it into a movie form.
Yeah, kind of. When people talk about sort of film theory, they often talk about what's called the 3-act structure of movie stories, which is basically the establishment of the conflict in the first 2 acts and then the resolution in the second one. I'm probably butchering it a little bit. So most like Disney films, things like that, you can see the 3-act structure pretty clearly. And this movie, I think, follows basically the same thing, but gives you that sort of like very direct indication of the structure through the title cards.
Yeah, I think it's well, at least the major sections are like 2, but I believe they go like at least 4 sections if I recall correctly. They just like cut to the last one towards the end. They go like 4 seasons: spring and summer, autumn and winter. I think it ends in winter if I recall correctly. And yeah, the span is like 5-6 years roughly, because at the end, now we're entering this spoiler territory when guy is already married and with his kid, Francois, if I remember correctly. So yeah, but yeah, the progression does make very clear the tonal changes too. Like when guy comes back from the war, it gets really down.
Yeah, that's actually one part that I wish might have been expanded upon a bit, because the war, for those who don't know, was the Algerian War, which was a very bloody conflict in kind of the breakdown of what was then the French Empire. And I would have liked to have seen more kind of the stress that it put Guy under, and just seeing what happened, especially because he wound up getting shot, I think, as well. And while we kind of just see that in the way he treats him coming back to his former job, it's not. It could have been done, I think, could have been drawn out a bit more, but at the same time, it would have stretched out the second act as well as, the third act, as well as lengthening the film in general.
Yeah, and I guess you can make kind of a case for it where it's still a musical and should still follow this sort of pretty lighthearted like general tone that maybe that wouldn't fit into so well. It is
Right.
already a pretty like relatively dreary compared to most other musicals I've seen, I guess.
Well, it does because it's interesting because I mentioned in my intro for this that there's at least one happy ending in this, and I think that is Guy himself. Particularly the very last scene where you see basically Guy, so to speak, give up wanting to be with Genevieve. Like he's moved on, he has his own life with his own wife and child now, and you see how happy he is at the very end as he's playing with his kid in the snow, and then they go inside. Whereas the one who doesn't have the happy ending is Genevieve, and which is kind of a twist because she was the one from the very beginning of the movie that was all sing-song, happy, lovey-dovey. That every nothing almost Disney princessified in the very beginning, and then she winds up kind of through the way she acts and the way she kind of looks at that very last scene to be kind of like she doesn't like where she's at right now and kind of has many regrets.
Yeah,
Which
so
I
that's
think is interesting.
we can definitely say that's how where the film's message gets conveyed, which is kind of this idea that you shouldn't almost sell out, as Genevieve does, kind of trading in her love for the like, material comfort, marrying this richer guy.
Yeah, I think that was a good point about that, and it was part of what I meant, that you can have like even though you go through some hardships and losing what was originally your ideal, you can still end up with like a satisfying ending to your life, or at least that stage. Because yeah, the guy does look very happy with his family towards the end, and and I think he kind of deserves it, because I do feel for him losing his daughter, since Genevieve also had originally Guy's daughter, but he never saw her until basically 5 years later when they meet with her again. And yeah, I I think we had mentioned, and a partially joke, that the message of this film was having patience and not listening to a Roach mother.
Yeah.
Yes. So I guess that segues into another point I want to make is we could probably, at least I can state who the villain, if we want to call it, of this play is, and that is Genevieve's mother. Very much the pretending to work in the best interest of her daughter, yet at the same time, it's really for herself. I mean, the way she kind of fawns over Roland, and not so much because he's handsome or charming or kind, is because he's rich. And it's the film sets it up in such a way that that's the main reason, because as we know in the beginning of the film, she gets a letter from, I want to assume it's the bank or whoever she has the loans through with her business that she runs, that she now is demanding, or the bank is now demanding this exorbitant pay that she has to come up with. And she's in distraught that she'll have to sell the place and then go into very dire straits. And this is kind of like Roland showing up, offering to marry Genevieve is kind of a godsend for her. And it speaks to the point too of how this kind of, I want to, if I can use the word capitalist mentality, affects people. One scene in particular when Genevieve is originally discussing with her mother the potential of at least meeting Roland over dinner. Genevieve recommends, since they're in dire straits, recommends selling some of her mother's things. And her mother goes, "We don't have anything." And yet I noticed this, that she's sitting in a very well-to-do apartment with fine china, interesting artwork and paintings and so on and so forth, and yet is just oblivious to what she actually has. And it's almost like this aristocratic type of mindset that I just found baffling, but also ironic at the same time.
Yeah. I think it's probably overstating it a little bit to call her the villain, but I can see what you mean. It is her ideas and mentality that kind of lead to all the negative consequences in the story, at least. Yeah, it kind of shows this contrast as well between like the romance, the sort of fictionalized romance it initially appears to be, and then sort of the real world concerns and the reality of the situation in general that kind of comes in and shatters all that, which I think is a nice aspect of the story.
Yeah, the aspect of the Genevieve's mother trying to hoard everything that she has come up, the jewels and everything is something that Genevieve does point out that she could sell some of her jewels, and she's like, oh, I can't sell these jewels because they're not in style these days or something like that. And then she does end up she relents to selling her pearl necklace, which is what introduces him to Roland. And Roland uh, Orini offers to sell it for her and give her basically the entire cut rather than having some for him, since he's diamond, a diamond seller, if I remember correctly, the diamond jewel. And yeah,
Yes.
it's basically what you have mentioned, that the mother is trying like to live vicariously through Genevieve what she couldn't have, or what she still wants to have in life, because they are basically having Kassar in their life is a whole package deal. That it would also ensure her own well-being. Her uh, jet set lifestyle, let's say.
Yeah. So, do you think that the narrative decision to kill off the mother at the end of the film is related to this in any way? Because it doesn't really seem directly to be so. There's no real indication that her death was a result of the way she lived, or really what caused it at all. But I'm not sure why they would have put it in exactly.
Um, the only thing I could maybe fathom, and it's a bit of I'm stretching it a bit, but the fact that all this worry about finances and whether or not you'll be able to afford the nice jewelry and the china and stuff that she has, is that in the end it's all kind of for naught. The very American saying, you don't take anything with you to the grave. That's about the only thing I could maybe pick out of this. But then again, like I said, it's a bit of a stretch at that.
Yeah, so she get the idea of her death gets like introduced right at the end through dialogue with Genevieve, but there's no arc about her being sick or anything like that leading up to it. I think it might have just been a decision to sort of help sell the more depressing tone of how their lives have turned out in the final scene, and maybe to give a little parallel with Guy, who also loses his grandmother.
But, was it her grandma? I think it was just like she had raised him. It wasn't directly.
Okay.
I don't remember correctly if so, but that's what I remember, because she always called her aunt, well, it was like her aunt, I think, actually, Aunt Elise or something. But yeah,
Uh,
it wasn't a direct relative, if I remember correctly.
And I guess the only other thing too, maybe, is that it's a point in making that it's another part of Genevieve's life that has kind of just evaporated. Because we can tell by that end scene that the husband's nowhere to be found, the mother's dead, and it's just her and her daughter in this case. And I think maybe that's just kind of, maybe it's just to re-emphasize the state that Genevieve is in right now, that despite her being so happy-go-lucky and fully romantically in love at the beginning of the film, she's very much in the uh, rung of probably the worst point in her life, maybe, if I can say that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is part of it. And again, that's designed to reinforce the message that the movie's trying to get across.
Yeah, basically, unlike Guy at the end, she basically picked Kassar over her because of her mother's advice and insistence. But Guy at the end stays with Madeleine because she was there for him when he came back, and yes, in that case, as we had mentioned before, he does get like the happy ending, if we can call it that. It's bittersweet, but it's still the overall best outcome for the original two mains.
Okay, yeah. So this is another thing that we can compare with La La Land, which is the sort of final message of that movie is essentially comes down to follow your dreams. Don't let the things that get in the way stop you. And something that's interesting about that kind of relates to something I've been thinking about lately is there was a bit of a controversy surrounding La La Land in comparison to the movie Moonlight. It was partially related to race, but it was also to do with the subject matter that both films deal with, where La La Land was kind of an almost naive, like relatively happy-go-lucky film, and people kind of thought that prevented it from being high art in the same way that Moonlight, which deals with much more difficult, darker, sort of depressing stuff, could be. And I think that's something kind of a trap that I've fallen into for much of my teenage and adult life, where I thought the only proper way to sort of have anything be artistic was to have it be really dour, downbeat, and depressing.
Hmm. You mean like the works that you create?
And the ones that I like the most as well. I almost had this mental blocker where if something was cheery and had a happy ending, I thought it couldn't be any good, or that automatically made it inane.
I see. Yeah, well,
Maybe cliche, at least.
Yeah. Which I don't think is strictly true, because at the very least you can see the artistry that goes into things that are a lot cheerier. A good example that I watched recently is actually Singing in the Rain, which is a very well-regarded movie, so it kind of defeats my idea about this being a broadly common idea, but it follows a pretty straightforward narrative structure and everything like that, and it ends on a very happy note, but most of the artistry that it's so renowned for is in the choreography of the dance scenes and the song numbers and things like that, and the humor of it. So, and I do think that's a really good movie.
Well, I guess maybe too, then it relates to kind of the whole point of making a stage play, because at the end of the day, the stage writer or the people producing the stage play need to bring people into the seats. And if it's a very dry, dour, sad story, it's not going to pack the theaters. Which is, I think, maybe a difference, say, that something very similar, but opera or a more proper stage play like Shakespeare can get away with. One, because it's something like Shakespeare's already been around and has been done for centuries. And then opera, because that's kind of just the nature of that art form. Whereas your more modern stage plays, like this, in a sense, like something from Rodgers and Hammerstein or Andrew Lloyd Webber, it needs to be financially successful. So it has to have this, in a way, mass market appeal.
Yeah, something that's interesting we can talk about with Shakespeare in connection to that is that he kind of has, as well as his more like profound meditations and poetic elements, he incorporates a lot of sort of lowbrow comedy into his plays, which I think might also have been back in the era when he was originally writing, designed to draw in a larger audience. So a good example that most people know is the first scene of Romeo and Juliet with the two squires from the feuding families, basically just a collection of dick jokes.
Yeah, so the other one that comes to mind too is Falstaff in many of the kingly plays that Shakespeare put on. It's also very much a comic relief character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I think I had mentioned regarding the tone of this and how much I would like it, that I felt that in part because of its melancholic nature, I enjoyed it more than I expected, because I thought it wasn't just going to be a standard happy musical with its bright color palette, but turns out there was a bit more melancholy in it. Without going much into spoilers and a musical, I mentioned that my favorite film, Cinema Paradiso, really reminded me a bit of it, in that it does have like a more melancholic take on certain aspects of what happens to the main character in the film, and it's something that Cinema Paradiso is Italian and this one was French. It's maybe like a more European thing on these tales that seem more of coming of age or musicals about young love, that they do incorporate more elements that would seem more tragic and for audiences here in general. And yeah, that was something that I basically made me enjoy it more than I would expected.
Well, what if Ennio Morricone did the score for this film? Would that make it one of your favorite musicals of all time?
I don't know, but I do love his work from what we've seen and what I've heard of him too in other movies.
Yeah. Okay. So Rain, you reminded me of something else we talked about during the movie, which was that we didn't know for sure if the having them sing every single line of dialogue throughout the entire film was like more of a common technique in French or in like European musicals, or if it was just something that was done specifically for this film. So I think we still don't know that. So if there's anyone in the audience thinking we're complete ignoramuses for that, I have to apologize. I should have researched it.
I mean, it is interesting. Like I said, it's the first time I've seen a play like that where every single line is sung. I can't, I mean, I didn't hate it, but I can't necessarily say whether or not wouldn't mind seeing that in other plays or musicals. I'd have to see more to really get a firm opinion on it.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind watching another one that does the same thing, but like I said before, I do think I overall prefer the other way of doing a musical, where there's specific, like a separation between the song numbers and the spoken dialogue.
I think maybe what I would need to see is one that's done that way, but in English, because I think maybe the disconnect for me was the fact that it was in French and I didn't necessarily pick up on the nuances of when the words were sung versus what was actually being said in the subtitles.
It was a lot of acclimatizing to do at once, too, I guess, with it being both our first French musical and our first one doing that.
I think also something to notice is that at least, I don't remember, the film is sung the entire way, but there isn't really like a choreography or dance number. Like you've seen sometimes in our musicals, that is in a moment that they have like
Right.
also a choreography for it. It's just like if you remove the music out of it, it would just lose a bit of rhythm. But there's not like any choreography or something that you could say that will make it jarring.
Yep.
Right. Which is usual for at least like some Rodgers and Hammerstein films that I've seen, where especially when you have the pieces where the entire cast suddenly comes out and starts singing. You don't get that at all here. You don't get like the random blokes walking down the street suddenly breaking into song and dance with the main characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no basically like it's not like your standard musical. Definitely, it was a very different experience. Yeah, well, I don't know if you have anything else to say about it.
Yeah, there's one more thing I want to say, which is that if you're somebody who's looking to learn French, I would definitely recommend this film for that, because I think to accommodate the singing, most of the sentences are quite short and the French is very simple. So somebody who's been studying French but not very good at it, I found that I could actually understand a lot of the dialogue and see how it connected to the subtitles. I think I might have had a decent chance of understanding what was going on even without them. That was something I kind of liked about it personally.
God, that actually gave me a nightmare of thinking, what if Tarkovsky made a musical?
How do you do long shots with nothing going on for 10 minutes in a musical?
There'd just be a single note playing for 10 minutes.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, well, it would. will have been like an entire scale elongated for like 10 minutes, just. And then we will have probably had the shot of guy arriving back to Cherbourg, and then just 10 minutes of him moping around. Yeah, no, that would have been insane. Well, yeah, no, I think that is it. Thank you for listening. See you next time.